Presiding Officer, the common fisheries policy of the EEC and EU has hung over our fish catchers in my constituency ever since the Tory government sold out our interests when they took us in. You'll not find a single occasion when I've stated it was good for us. I agree with the Scottish Fishermen's Federation when they say in their helpfully concise briefing that we need fairer and more appropriate shares of catching opportunities for the Scottish fishing industry within our own waters. It is worth parenthetically saying the establishment of the 200-mile limit did not necessarily extinguish access for countries who fished on those waters prior to its establishment. And it's not clear whether leaving the CFP delivers all these waters to Scotland. But that's for another day. My first speech on the CFP was here in 2001, the day after I was sworn in to Parliament. I was able to say then, I'm happy to agree with Jamie McGregor, who was then a Tory MSP, who spoke yesterday of the need for more local control. We in the SNP have advocated that for many years. I go further in two respects. One of the most frustrating aspects of the common fisheries policy for our fishermen lies in our ability to suspend fishing rights in an area of our interest, but only to apply to our own boats. Other nations' boats can continue to fish in areas where our boats cannot. That is something that must end. Secondly, the right to fish is essentially provided by a grant of quota from government and at no cost to fishermen. Therefore, I suggest any value associated with quota must remain a public asset. And we must look for ways to make it an asset from which local fishing communities as a whole can benefit. Equally, we need to find a way to be fair to fishermen who've paid for quota in good faith. If we need any knowledge of Tory thinking on this subject, we need look no further than Philip Booth of the Institute of Economic Affairs. He writes on Conservative Home, the solution is to establish property rights in sea fisheries, and goes on to suggest an international trade in these rights. This is absolutely opposed by our fishermen and runs entirely counter to broader community demands for local control. Once again, an indication that the Tories wish to sell out the interests of our fishing communities. And Tories, in doing so, are departing from their previous MSP, Jamie McGregor's position, with which I was able to agree in 2001. As the Fishermen's Federation and others acknowledge, we need a new fisheries management system. Like those in Iceland, the Faroes, Norway, our fishermen need to be inside the room while the local detail is determined. That fundamentally means that control of fisheries in our waters cannot be left to Westminster, the people who took us into the CFP, and have a track record of selling us out when negotiations on fishing take place. It must instead be controlled here in this Parliament, but with significant local decision-making by local communities embedded in the process. But it's also worth saying, of course, that fishing is simply not about catching alone. The economically larger part, and larger by employment, is fish processing. Its interests require the free movement of people and unfettered access to the very large market that is the EU single market. I was interested that Mr Tompkins appeared to suggest that Brexit means leaving the EU single market. I thought the question on the ballot paper said leaving the EU. It didn't commit us to leaving the EU single market. I will.
Mr Tompkins.
I'm grateful. My view is that Brexit requires us to ask what kind of access to the single market is now in the national interest.
The national interest is clearly expressed as access to all the rights and privileges of being able, without visas, without paperwork, without costs, to be able to continue to sell into the market and to engage people from across the European Union in our industries. In my constituency, in the fish processing industry, it has proved impossible to rely solely on local labour. Factories in my constituency now, even after local layoffs, continue to have vacancies. Secondary schools in Fraserburgh and Peterhead illustrate this point with a couple of dozen languages in each of them. Being in the single market could cut us off from all of that. Merely having access can mean that all of these barriers are likely to be created, and we damage the interests of Scotland and indeed, for that matter, the wider UK. Let me just say a word or two about what the Tories appear to want today. From the government motion, they wish to delete agreed UK approach, meaning they want Westminster to decide. They delete objective Scotland to remain inside the EU market, meaning they want to damage our exports. They delete protect social protection, meaning they want to remove safety nets for the vulnerable. Finally, I understand that many of my constituents voted to use June's vote to get out of the CFP, albeit that the Leave vote in my constituency was only 1,000 more than in East Aberdeenshire. But Scotland now has interests that are important. We should, for example, lead on fishing negotiations for the UK as a whole, not delegate decisions to Westminster, but I'm not holding my breath. Presiding Officer.